The scent of roses, even in the heart of winter, clung to the old Victorian, a ghostly embrace that was both comforting and heartbreaking. My name is Eleanor Vance, but everyone called me Ellie. At 30, my hands, once nimble with paintbrushes, were now etched with the invisible lines of 10 years of caregiving. The world outside, with its bustling art galleries and vibrant city life, felt like a distant dream, a life I'd once touched but now only vaguely remembered. My reality was here within these four walls, where time was measured not by seasons but by medication schedules, gentle coaxing, and the slow, relentless erosion of my mother's memory. My mother, Margaret Vance, had been a force of nature. A renowned landscape architect, her creations graced estates across New England, each a testament to her vision and her unparalleled understanding of beauty. But her true masterpiece was our home nestled in the quiet, tree-lined suburb of Maplewood, Massachusetts. Specifically, it was the rose garden. Every variety, every hue, every fragrant petal told a story, a chapter in her life meticulously cultivated and loved. She had designed it herself, starting when I was a child, a kaleidoscope of color and scent that always brought a smile to her face. Now it was a silent sentinel dormant under a thin blanket of snow, waiting for a spring I sometimes feared she wouldn't truly see. Lewy body dementia had stolen my mother piece by agonizing piece. It began subtly with misplaced keys and forgotten names, then progressed to hallucinations, tremors, and a profound confusion that often left her terrified and disoriented. I remembered the day 10 years ago when the diagnosis had come. I was 20, fresh out of art school with a scholarship for a prestigious New York gallery internship, my dreams tangible, almost within reach. But how could I leave? How could I abandon the woman who had nurtured every artistic impulse, cheered every sketch, and believed in me with an unwavering faith? My older sister, Cassandra, or Cassie as she preferred, had been quick to offer her pragmatic solution. "Ellie, you're the artist," she had stated, her voice as crisp and unyielding as a freshly starched shirt. "Your life is here. I have a career, a family, responsibilities in Seattle. It makes perfect sense for you to stay." And so I stayed. The internship faded into a wistful memory, my paintbrushes gathered dust, and my life became a testament to selfless devotion. My mornings began before dawn, not with the eager anticipation of a canvas, but with the quiet whir of the coffee maker and the gentle rustle of Margaret's sheets. Some mornings she would wake up confused, calling out for her own mother, a child lost in the labyrinth of her mind. Other days, a flicker of her old self would surface. I remembered a morning last spring when the first blush of pink appeared on a climbing rose outside her window. She had pointed with a trembling finger, her eyes wide with a fleeting recognition. "My blushing bride," she had whispered, a rare moment of clarity that brought tears to my eyes. "Your father gave me that one, Ellie. Our first anniversary." It was moments like these, fleeting and precious, that made every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every ounce of emotional exhaustion worth it. Our days were a delicate dance of routine. I would help her with her morning care, patiently guiding her through dressing her body, stiff and uncooperative. Her hands, once so strong and sure in the garden, now fumbled with buttons. "Thank you, darling," she would often say, her voice raspy. "You are such a good girl. My little angel." Those words were my fuel, the warmth that chased away the cold tendrils of loneliness and regret. Breakfast was a struggle. Sometimes she would refuse to eat, convinced the food was poisoned or that I was a stranger. Other times she would devour it with an almost childlike enthusiasm, humming a forgotten tune. I mastered the art of gentle persuasion, of turning mundane tasks into small games, of finding joy in the tiniest victories. After breakfast, we would sit by the bay window in the living room overlooking the dormant rose garden. I would read to her, usually from her old gardening books, even though I suspected the words rarely truly registered. Yet the rhythm of my voice seemed to soothe her, and sometimes her eyes would drift towards the garden, a faint, contented smile gracing her lips. This house, our home, was imbued with the very essence of Margaret. Every piece of furniture, every painting on the wall, every book on the shelf told a story of her life, her passions, her triumphs. The living room, with its grand fireplace and worn armchairs, held echoes of countless family gatherings. The kitchen, where she had taught me to bake her famous apple pie, still smelled faintly of cinnamon and warmth. And my own bedroom, just down the hall from hers, was a sanctuary filled with childhood memories. The lavender walls, I had chosen the window seat where I would read for hours, the scent of her perfume lingering on an old scarf. This wasn't just a house. It was a living, breathing archive of our lives, a legacy of love. Margaret had always been fiercely independent, a woman who built her own company from the ground up. She was meticulous about her affairs, her finances, and her future. In her more lucid moments before the dementia tightened its grip, she had spoken often of her wishes. "Ellie, my love," she had said countless times, holding my hand, her eyes clear and unwavering. "This house, this garden, it's all for you. You've given up so much for me. This is your home, my darling. It always will be. It's your inheritance, a thank you for your beautiful heart." She had also mentioned a small trust fund set aside to help me pursue my art career when the time was right, a fund, she said, Cassie and her husband Robert had helped her set up years ago. I remember feeling a surge of both gratitude and relief. Not for the money itself, but for the validation, for knowing that my sacrifice had been seen, appreciated, and that my future, though deferred, was still secure. I trusted her, implicitly loved her fiercely, and in my quiet, unwavering devotion, I poured every ounce of my being into making her remaining days as comfortable and joyful as possible. Cassie, on the other hand, was a different chapter altogether. My older sister by 10 years, she had always been the ambitious one, the pragmatist, the one who saw the world in terms of profit margins and strategic alliances. She lived in Seattle, a successful businesswoman married to Robert Sterling, a corporate lawyer whose suits always looked impeccably tailored and whose smile rarely reached his eyes. Their visits were infrequent, usually during major holidays, and even then they felt more like obligations than genuine family reunions. I remembered last Thanksgiving, Cassie and Robert had flown in, bringing their two perfect children, 10-year-old Emily and 8-year-old Noah. While the kids played quietly with their iPads, Cassie had hovered, offering unsolicited advice about Margaret's care. "Are you sure she's getting enough protein, Ellie?" she had asked, her gaze sweeping over the plate of pureed vegetables I had prepared. "And I read that essential oils can really help with cognitive decline. Have you tried those?" Her suggestions, while superficially helpful, always felt like thinly veiled criticisms of my methods. Robert, usually quiet, had chimed in during dinner, asking about the house's upkeep. "The property taxes here in Maplewood are quite high, aren't they, Ellie?" he had inquired, not unkindly but with a calculated glint in his eye. "And with Margaret's medical expenses, it must be quite a drain." I had simply nodded, explaining that Margaret's long-term care insurance and a small pension covered most medical bills, and I managed the house expenses from what was left, always meticulously balancing the books. Cassie would then interject, "Well, if you ever need anything, Ellie, just let us know. We're happy to send some money for household repairs or whatever." And she would usually a check for a few $100s, occasionally $1,000, always with a note reiterating her support and my dedication. I never saw it as an insult, merely her way of contributing a practical solution from a practical person. I convinced myself she was simply busy, that her absence didn't diminish her love for Mother, only her capacity to express it in person. She was a busy executive. I was the one with time. Me sacrifices felt monumental at times. My art supplies, once a constant companion, now lay dormant in a dusty box in the attic. My dreams of exhibiting my work, of seeing my name in a gallery program, had been carefully packed away, a promise to my future self that I would revisit them someday. But someday felt increasingly distant, a faint glimmer on a perpetually receding horizon. The emotional toll was immense. There were days when Margaret's confusion would escalate, when her accusations would cut deep, when her screams of terror would echo through the house, leaving me trembling and heartbroken. In those moments, I would retreat to the rose garden, even in winter, bundling up against the cold, finding solace in the stark beauty of the dormant bushes, a quiet reminder of resilience and rebirth. I would tell myself that this profound act of love was my greatest masterpiece, and that when the time came when Margaret finally found her peace, I would have a home, a sanctuary, and the means to finally pick up my brushes again. Just a few months ago, Margaret had a particularly lucid day. The kind of day that felt like a gift from the heavens, a brief return of the woman I knew. We were sitting in the living room, a rare ray of winter sun streaming through the bay window, warming our faces. She looked at me, her eyes clear and filled with an almost youthful intensity. "Ellie," she had said, her voice strong, "I know what I'm doing. I know who I'm leaving everything to. You, my love. You deserve it. More than anyone. This house, this garden, it's a part of me and it belongs to you." She had even hummed a little tune, "A Bushel and a Peck," a song she used to sing to me as a child. I had hugged her tightly, tears stinging my eyes, overwhelmed by her love and her unwavering faith in me. "Thank you, Mama," I had whispered, burying my face in her soft silver hair. "Thank you." That day in particular solidified my conviction. My mother knew. She understood. She appreciated my devotion. And she had made arrangements. I didn't need to worry about the future. My future was intrinsically linked to this house, to this garden, to the legacy of my mother's love. It was a tangible representation of her gratitude, a promise fulfilled. I wasn't just a caregiver. I was an inheritor of love, memory, and a future that, though put on hold, was waiting for me. I believed this with every fiber of my being. But the cold reality was that Margaret's health was in a rapid decline. The lucid days became fewer and farther between. The tremors in her hands grew more pronounced, her speech more slurred. There were times when she barely recognized me, looking at me with wide, frightened eyes, asking who I was. Each instance was a fresh stab to my heart, a cruel reminder of the thief that was stealing her from me. I spent my nights poring over medical journals, searching for some miracle, some intervention, anything that could slow the inevitable. I spoke with her doctors regularly, their voices always kind, but their words filled with a quiet finality. Hospice care had become a more frequent topic of conversation. I knew deep down that our time together was drawing to a close. The thought was a sharp physical ache in my chest. I clung to every last moment, every gentle touch, every soft sigh. I would hold her hand for hours, telling her stories of her own life, hoping that some small fragment would pierce through the fog. I would show her photographs of the rose garden in full bloom, pointing out each rose, describing its scent, its history. Sometimes a faint smile would touch her lips, and I would take it as a sign, a whisper of recognition from the depths of her fading mind. One crisp autumn morning a month ago, the phone rang while I was helping Margaret with her physical therapy. It was Cassie. Her voice, usually so composed, held a hint of urgency. "Ellie," she had said without much preamble, "Robert and I are flying out next week. We need to discuss Mother's estate. The financial burden is becoming unsustainable and we need to make sure everything is in order." My stomach clenched. "What do you mean, Cassie? Mother's long-term care insurance covers most of it and her pension." I had started to explain, but she cut me off, her tone firm. "Ellie, you've been so wonderfully dedicated, but you're not a financial expert. Robert and I have been reviewing her accounts and there are some discrepancies. We need to ensure Mother's legacy is protected for everyone's sake." A cold knot formed in my stomach. Discrepancies protected for everyone's sake. The words sounded innocuous enough, but an unidentifiable fear began to prickle at the back of my neck. I tried to push it away. Cassie was just being practical, I told myself. She was looking out for Mother, for our family. She was ensuring everything was handled properly, just as Mother would have wanted. And Mother had always been so clear about her wishes for me. So despite the unease, I told Cassie I would be happy to discuss it. I loved my mother and I trusted her completely. What could possibly go wrong? The last week had been a blur of intensified care, of watching Margaret's breathing grow shallower, her eyes more distant. There were no more lucid moments, no more whispers of the blushing bride, just the slow, steady fading. I barely slept, holding her hand through the long, silent nights, murmuring words of love and comfort. I remembered her telling me years ago, "Ellie, a rose garden needs constant care, but it also needs trust. Trust in its resilience, trust in its ability to bloom again no matter how harsh the winter." I held onto those words, a lifeline in the deepening darkness. And now this morning, as the first pale light of dawn crept through the curtains, illuminating the gentle rise and fall of Margaret's chest, I knew it was time. Her breathing was almost imperceptible, a faint whisper against the silence of the room. I leaned in close, pressing my cheek against hers, feeling the coolness of her skin. "I love you, Mama," I whispered, my voice thick with unshed tears. "Thank you for everything. Go to sleep, my beautiful rose." A faint sigh, almost imperceptible, escaped her lips, and then stillness. The scent of roses in the air seemed to deepen, a final poignant farewell. My mother, my world, was gone. And I, Eleanor Vance, the devoted daughter, was adrift. But I still had the house. And the garden. Or so I believed. The stillness that followed my mother's last breath was not a peaceful silence, but a vast, echoing emptiness that swallowed every sound, every thought, every hope. I stayed there for what felt like an eternity, curled beside her, clutching her now cold hand, wishing I could somehow breathe life back into her, back into us. The scent of roses, once a comfort, now felt like a cruel mockery, reminding me of the vibrant life that had just departed. Grief, raw and brutal, ripped through me, a physical agony that made it hard to breathe. I remembered her laugh, a bright melodic sound that could fill any room. I remembered her hands, strong yet gentle, guiding mine as we planted new rose bushes, dirt clinging to our fingernails. "Ellie," she would say, her eyes twinkling, "a garden is a testament to hope. Even when winter seems to have claimed everything, the roots hold fast, waiting for the spring." Now my own roots felt severed, drifting aimlessly in a barren, frozen landscape. Eventually, the harsh realities of the world intruded. The hospice nurse Sarah, a kind woman who had become a quiet confidant over the last few months, gently placed a hand on my shoulder. "Eleanor," she had said, her voice soft, "she's at peace now." Her words, meant to soothe, felt hollow. How could there be peace when my entire world had just collapsed? I nodded numbly, allowing her to take over the necessary arrangements. While Sarah made calls, I retreated to my mother's rose garden, stumbling through the thin snow, my eyes blurring with tears. The bare branches, usually a symbol of quiet resilience, now seemed to mock me with their stark, skeletal forms. "Mama," I whispered into the cold air, "what am I going to do without you?" The silence was my only answer. Cassie and Robert arrived from Seattle 2 days later, a whirlwind of designer luggage and muted condolences. I was still in a fog of grief, drifting through the house like a ghost, reliving every memory in every room. The living room where Margaret had taught me to play checkers. The kitchen where we'd baked countless pies. Even the small attic window where I'd often seen her looking out at her beloved garden. Each corner held a piece of her, a shard of a life now lost. Cassie, however, seemed to bypass the emotional landscape entirely. Her approach was immediate, efficient, and to my raw nerves, alarmingly businesslike. "Ellie, darling," she had said, embracing me briefly, her cheek feeling cool against mine. "I am so sorry for your loss." Mother was a wonderful woman. Her eyes, however, were already scanning the room, assessing, calculating. "Now we need to be practical. Robert has already started making arrangements for the funeral home. It's best if we handle everything quickly and efficiently, wouldn't you agree?" I had merely nodded, my voice a lump in my throat. I wanted to scream to tell her that grief wasn't efficient, that love wasn't practical, but the words were stuck, choked by sorrow. Cassie took charge with an almost alarming zeal. She chose the funeral home, selected the casket. A grand, polished mahogany affair that felt too formal, too distant from my mother's earthy, natural spirit. She organized the wake, dictating the guest list, making calls to distant relatives I barely knew. Mother always valued appearance, she had stated, her voice firm, and we must honor her memory with dignity and grace. There was no mention of the jazz music Mother adored, no thought of the vibrant wild garden flowers she preferred over stiff, store-bought arrangements, nothing of the simple, heartfelt gatherings she loved. It was a funeral for Cassie's idea of Margaret, a public performance designed to impress, not to truly mourn. I remember standing in the receiving line during the wake, my black dress feeling like a shroud. Relatives, colleagues of my mother I hadn't seen in years, friends of Cassie's. They all offered their condolences, their eyes filled with pity. Cassie beside me was a picture of poised grief. Her eyes were moist, her voice trembled slightly as she recounted anecdotes about Margaret's strength and vision, her dedication to her family. It was a flawless performance. But I knew. I saw the subtle tightening around her mouth, the way her gaze lingered on a particularly valuable antique lamp in the hallway. I felt a cold dread begin to coil in my stomach, a premonition of something dark and insidious stirring beneath the veneer of sisterly sympathy. One evening after the wake, as Robert finalized details with the funeral director over the phone, Cassie had found me in the kitchen staring blankly at the silent coffee maker. "Ellie," she had said, her tone softening, "I know this is incredibly hard for you. You were so devoted to Mother. Truly admirable." She had then sighed, a theatrical sound that grated on my nerves. "But we have to face the realities now. Mother's medical bills, the upkeep of this large house. It's a lot. Robert and I have been discussing it, and we think it's time to put everything in order." My heart hammered against my ribs. "What do you mean, Cassie?" I had asked, my voice barely a whisper. She had simply offered a tight, sympathetic smile. "We'll discuss it after the funeral, darling. Robert has arranged for the reading of the will a few days after. It's best to have everything officially settled." The funeral itself was a blur. A vast, impersonal church filled with strangers and acquaintances, a minister who spoke of my mother as if reading from a generic obituary. I sat in the front row beside Cassie and Robert, Emily, and Noah fidgeting beside them. My grief felt private, a silent scream trapped within my chest while around me, Cassie orchestrated a public spectacle. There was no mention of Mother's love for impromptu road trips, her terrible singing in the car, or the way she would sneak me extra scoops of ice cream before bed. The Margaret eulogized that day was a stranger, a polished, idealized version presented for public consumption. I remembered a rainy afternoon years ago when Mother and I had sat on the porch swing watching the storm. "Life isn't always sunshine, Ellie," she had told me, her arm around my shoulders. "Sometimes you need the rain to appreciate the bloom, and sometimes the most beautiful things grow in the storm." I clung to that memory, a secret comfort in the hollow echoes of the church. 3 days after the funeral, Robert informed me in his typically precise legal tone that the reading of the will had been scheduled for that afternoon at a downtown law firm. "It's a mere formality, Ellie," he had stated, his eyes devoid of warmth, "but necessary for the estate to be settled." I had dressed in the same black dress, feeling an inexplicable dread, a premonition that this formality would be anything but. The law office was hushed, sterile, and cold. Mr. Harrison, the estate lawyer, a thin, gray-haired man with perpetually tired eyes, sat at the head of a large mahogany table. Cassie and Robert sat on one side, a united front, their posture radiating quiet authority. I sat opposite them, feeling small and vulnerable, clutching my hands beneath the table. The air was thick with unspoken tension, a suffocating silence that pressed down on my chest. Mr. Harrison cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses. "We are here today for the reading of Margaret Vance's last will and testament." He then proceeded to read, his voice flat and devoid of emotion, the legal jargon washing over me in a confusing wave. My mind was racing, trying to grasp the meaning behind the words. I remembered Mother's clear pronouncements: "This house, this garden, it's all for you, Ellie. The trust fund, the security, my future." Then came the words that shattered my world. "Mr." Harrison paused, looking directly at me, his gaze almost apologetic. In the document dated 6 months ago, Ms. Vance explicitly states her desire to leave the majority of her estate, including the property at 142 Rosewood Lane, Maplewood, and all associated intellectual property and financial assets, to her eldest daughter, Cassandra. Sterling. This decision was based on Miss Sterling's proven financial acumen and ability to manage such significant assets responsibly. The room spun. My ears buzzed. I must have misheard. This couldn't be right. 6 months ago, that was around the time Mother had those increasingly long periods of confusion when she barely knew who I was. Wait, I had interrupted, my voice cracking. There must be a mistake. My mother, she told me. She promised me the house, the garden. She said it was for me, for all my care. Cassie had cut me off, her voice firm but tinged with a feigned sadness. Ellie, darling, Mother was very unwell in her last months. Her memory was unreliable. Robert and I, with her best interests at heart, helped her formalize her wishes when she had a moment of lucidity. She was worried about your ability to manage such a large estate given your artistic temperament. She wanted to ensure her legacy was in capable hands. Robert, ever the lawyer, had added smoothly, "Indeed, Ellie." Margaret, in her clearer moments, expressed concerns about the financial implications of leaving such substantial assets to someone without formal business experience. The new will reflects her considered judgment. You are, however, allocated a sum of $10,000 from a separate account as a token of her appreciation for your dedication. $10,000. 10 years of my life. 10 years of sacrificing my dreams, my youth, my identity, for $10,000. The injustice of it was a physical blow, leaving me breathless. "This is a lie," I had cried out, my voice finally finding its strength, though it trembled with fury. "Mother would never do this. You manipulated her. When she was sick, when she couldn't think straight." Cassie's expression hardened, the mask of sympathy slipping. "Eleanor, control yourself. You're grieving, I understand, but you're being irrational." Mother made her decision. Robert, as her legal counsel, ensured it was all perfectly legitimate. Robert had then taken out a document, sliding it across the polished table. "Here, Ellie. Power of attorney signed and witnessed. Margaret appointed Cassandra as her legal representative for all financial and healthcare decisions 6 months ago. The will was updated concurrently. Everything is perfectly legal, properly executed." I had stared at the signatures, my mother's shaky, almost illegible scrawl so different from her once elegant handwriting. And then Cassie's crisp, confident signature. A cold, hard knot of pure hatred began to form in my chest, displacing the grief. This wasn't just about money. It was about a profound betrayal, a desecration of my mother's memory, a calculated erasure of my sacrifice. "So what does this mean?" I had asked, my voice dangerously quiet. Mr. Harrison, looking uncomfortable, cleared his throat again. "It means, Eleanor, that Cassandra Sterling is now the legal owner of the property. The house, the garden, all of it. You will unfortunately need to vacate the premises within 1 week. Cassandra has graciously offered to assist you with finding temporary accommodation." Cassie had interjected, "Yes, Ellie, Robert and I have found a nice little studio apartment for you on the outskirts of Boston. It's affordable and it will give you time to get back on your feet. You can use the $10,000 for a deposit and first month's rent. You really should start thinking about a job now, darling. It's time to build your own life." Her words, delivered with a sickeningly sweet tone, felt like a whip lashing across my face. Build my own life. She had just systematically dismantled it. I had risen from my chair, my legs unsteady, but my resolve suddenly hardening. The grief was still there, a constant ache, but it was now overshadowed by a burning, all-consuming rage. I hadn't been building a life for myself. I had been tending to my mother's final years, a sacred duty. And now I was being cast out, robbed and lectured by the very person who had stolen everything from me. I won't accept this, I had stated, my voice low but steady, finally finding its unwavering core. This isn't what Mother wanted. Cassie had scoffed, a dismissive wave of her hand. Ellie, you're just upset. It's understandable. But the law is the law. Mother made her choices. No, I had countered, looking directly into her cold, calculating eyes. You made her choices, and you will regret it. I promise you, Cassie, you will regret this. I had walked out of that sterile office, leaving behind the chilling scent of betrayal. The city outside, usually a bustling symphony, now felt like a deafening roar. My vision blurred, not just with tears, but with a fierce, unyielding anger. I drove back to the house on Rosewood Lane, the house that was no longer mine, the rose garden now a silent witness to my ruin. That evening, the house felt alien, cold, and utterly unwelcoming. Cassie and Robert were already making plans. I heard Cassie on the phone, her voice animated, discussing renovations. Yes, we'll need to remove that old rose garden, she had said casually, as if talking about an overgrown weed. It's taking up too much space. We could put in a swimming pool or maybe a tennis court. The words echoed in the empty halls, each syllable a dagger to my heart. Remove the rose garden. My mother's legacy, the symbol of her life, my 10 years of devoted care, to be callously ripped out for a swimming pool. I spent that night in my bedroom packing a single suitcase. Every object I touched, every photograph, every book brought a fresh wave of pain and fury. I knew with an absolute certainty that I could not stay another moment in that house under her roof, breathing the air tainted by her deception. The $10,000 felt like blood money, an insult rather than an aid. I would not touch it. I would not accept her charity. As the first sliver of dawn painted the sky, I slipped out of the house. I left behind the packed suitcase, the $10,000 check, and a handwritten note on the kitchen counter addressed to Cassie. It simply read, "You think you've taken everything, but you haven't, and you never will. You've forgotten one thing about roses, Cassie. They have thorns. And they remember. I got into my ancient Honda Civic, the car Mother had given me for my 21st birthday, a small act of love that now felt like the only thing I truly possessed. With tears streaming down my face, not just from grief but from a burning righteous fury, I drove away from 142 Rosewood Lane. Away from the house that was no longer my home. Away from the ghost of my mother. And away from the monstrous betrayal of my sister. I had no destination, no plan, just a car, a heart full of broken dreams, and a soul ignited by an inferno of vengeance. My life as I knew it was over, but a new one born from the ashes of betrayal was just beginning. The winter had truly come for the rose garden and for me. And like the roots beneath the snow, I would hold fast. And I would remember. The biting wind that whipped through the empty Walmart parking lot felt like a physical assault, mirroring the turmoil in my soul. My first night, truly homeless, away from the deceptive comfort of the house on Rosewood Lane, was a descent into a hell I hadn't imagined possible. The ancient Honda Civic Mother's last tangible gift was now my only refuge, a metal shell against the indifferent world. I remembered the night I packed, the desperate finality of it all. I had chosen the library instead of her offered charity, my note, about the thorns of a rose, a flimsy shield against the tidal wave of despair. Now the weight of that decision pressed down on me, heavy and suffocating. The seats of the Civic, once comfortable for short drives with Mother, were a torture rack for sleep. My back ached, my legs cramped, and every creak of the car, every distant siren, every rumble of a passing truck sent a jolt of terror through me. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to conjure the image of my lavender bedroom, the soft mattress, the familiar scent of home. But all I saw was Cassie's cold, calculating smile, heard Robert's precise legal jargon, and felt the chilling reality that everything I had ever known, every ounce of security, had been ripped away. The grief for Mother was a constant dull throb, but now it was laced with a new venomous pain, the pain of betrayal, of utter abject destitution. This was the peak of my suffering, a canyon of despair that stretched endlessly before me. The days that followed blurred into a monotonous cycle of survival. My few remaining dollars dwindled rapidly, mostly spent on gas to keep the car running and warm in the chilly Massachusetts autumn, and on cheap, unsatisfying food from convenience stores, stale pastries, instant noodles heated with a brevet, portable burner water from public fountains. Dignity was the first casualty. I quickly realized that maintaining appearances was crucial. To be seen as homeless was to invite pity, judgment, or worse. I found a 24-hour gym paying the meager monthly fee, which became my sanctuary for showers and a moment of privacy in a stall. I would wake before dawn, drive to the gym, and try to make myself presentable using dry shampoo and baby wipes to stretch out the feeling of cleanliness. I remembered Mother's insistence on always looking one's best, even when tending to the garden. "Ellie," she would say, "presentation speaks volumes. It's a respect for yourself and for others." The irony now was a bitter taste in my mouth. Finding safe places to park was a constant gnawing anxiety. I rotated between different Walmart lots, the periphery of a large mall, and occasionally the quieter streets near the university campus, hoping my car would blend in with student vehicles. Sleep was a luxury I rarely afforded myself, constantly alert, my senses heightened to every shadow, every sound. Loneliness, however, was the cruelest torment. I had no one. My college friends had drifted away after I chose to care for Mother, and my world had shrunk to the four walls of our home. Now even those walls were gone. I would see families in their cars laughing, talking, and a deep aching void would open in my chest. I remembered the warmth of Mother's hand in mine, the quiet comfort of her presence. Now there was only the cold plastic of the steering wheel. One particularly bleak afternoon, weeks into my new existence, a torrential rainstorm lashed down, turning the car into a damp, claustrophobic prison. My clothes were perpetually clammy, the air thick with condensation. I was shivering despite layering every piece of clothing I owned. I remembered a conversation with Mother years ago when she was teaching me about tending to winter roses. "Ellie," she had explained, "the most important thing is protection. The roots need insulation, the plant needs shelter from the harshest winds. Without it, even the strongest rose can wither." I felt myself withering, my spirit being slowly crushed under the relentless weight of my circumstances. It was then, in the suffocating dampness of the Civic, that a flash of incandescent rage, sharp and invigorating, cut through my despair. Cassie. She was warm, dry, comfortable, sleeping in my bed, enjoying my inheritance, destroying my mother's legacy. The image of her casual comment about ripping out the rose garden for a swimming pool flared in my mind, a burning ember. It was a desecration. A profound, unforgivable act of contempt. My suffering until this point had been a passive endurance. But in that moment, something shifted. The thorns Mother spoke of, the ones I had promised Cassie she would feel, began to prickle deep within my soul. The despair hadn't lessened, but now it had a direction, a focus. It transformed into a cold, hard resolve. I would not just survive, I would make her pay. My first thought was the will. Robert had said it was perfectly legal. But was it? How could Mother in her right mind have made such a drastic change, going against everything she had ever told me? I needed information. I needed to understand the legal machinations that had robbed me. The library. It was the only place I could think of with free internet access and quiet anonymity. The next morning, the rain had subsided, leaving behind a crisp, cold air. I drove to the main branch of the Boston Public Library, a grand, imposing building that offered a stark contrast to my car-bound existence. Inside, surrounded by towering shelves of books and the hushed whispers of patrons, I felt a flicker of my old self, the scholar, the artist. I found an empty computer terminal and began my research. I started with simple searches contesting a willpower of attorney fraud, elderly Lewy body, dementia, legal capacity. The legal jargon was dense, but I meticulously took notes on scraps of paper, trying to piece together the puzzle. I discovered that contesting a will, especially one executed with a power of attorney, was incredibly difficult, requiring substantial legal resources and irrefutable evidence of undue influence or lack of testamentary capacity. I had neither. Yet the information sparked a tiny, almost imperceptible ember of hope. The document Robert had presented, signed 6 months prior, was crucial. 6 months prior, Mother was deep in her dementia with only fleeting moments of lucidity. It seemed impossible she could have comprehended such complex legal decisions. But how to prove it? Then my research shifted. I started looking into Cassie Sterling and Robert Sterling. Their names were surprisingly easy to find. Cassie was a VP at a prominent tech company in Seattle. Robert was a partner at a well-known corporate law firm. I found news articles about their lavish lifestyle, their charitable contributions, their power couple image. The pictures showed Cassie smiling brightly, an arm linked with Robert's, their faces radiating success and privilege. A wave of nausea mixed with a renewed surge of hatred washed over me. These were the people who had stolen my life. I delved deeper, searching for any public records related to their businesses, their financial dealings. It was a shot in the dark, but I was desperate. I spent hours, days, even in the library, losing myself in the labyrinth of online databases, public records, and obscure legal journals. My mind, once consumed by grief and fear, was now sharp-focused, driven by a singular purpose. The hunger that gnawed at my stomach, the cold that seeped into my bones, they became secondary to this new, intense pursuit. One afternoon, while searching through a database of corporate filings, I stumbled upon something peculiar. Robert Sterling, through his law firm, had represented a small, struggling landscaping supply company based in rural Massachusetts about a year and a half ago. The company had faced significant financial difficulties, teetering on the brink of bankruptcy. I recognized the name immediately: Green Thumbs, Inc. It was one of Mother's old competitors, a company she had always spoken of with a mix of pity and disdain, saying they cut corners and used substandard materials. Why would Robert, a high-flying corporate lawyer from Seattle, be involved with a small, local, struggling company in Massachusetts? It seemed utterly out of place. I remembered Mother once mentioning in a rare moment of anger about a stolen client that Green Thumbs, Inc. was known for some shady dealings in its past, cutting corners and even forging signatures on supply orders to save money. At the time, I hadn't thought much of it. Now a cold, calculating spark ignited in my mind. Could there be a connection? I shifted my focus to Green Thumbs, Inc. I found old news articles, court filings regarding minor disputes, even a few disgruntled customer reviews mentioning questionable business practices. It wasn't concrete evidence of anything, but it was a thread, a tiny, almost invisible thread, but a thread nonetheless. I felt a surge of adrenaline, a rush of satisfaction that cut through the lingering desolation. This was it. This was the first thorn. I meticulously copied down every piece of relevant information: names of the company owners, their financial history, any legal actions they had faced, the names of any other lawyers involved. My heart pounded with a new, exhilarating rhythm. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about strategy. It was about playing their game, but with my own rules from the shadows. The physical discomfort of my life didn't disappear, but its psychological grip loosened. The fear of discovery, the gnawing loneliness, they were still there, but now they were secondary to the almost addictive thrill of the chase. Each piece of information I uncovered, however, small, was a victory, a tiny chip knocked off the formidable wall Cassie and Robert had built around themselves. I started eating better, finding ways to stretch my meager funds to buy more nutritious food, recognizing that my brain needed to be sharp. I even started to look forward to my library visits, not just as a means to an end, but as a place where I could feel intelligent, capable, alive again. One evening, as I was packing up my notes, an elderly librarian, Miss Evans, a kind-faced woman with spectacles perched on her nose, approached my terminal. She had often seen me there, diligently working. "Eleanor, dear," she had said, her voice gentle, "you're here so often. Are you working on a research project?" I hesitated, then decided to risk a partial truth. "Yes, Miss Evans," I had replied, my voice slightly hoarse. "It's a personal project, related to a family estate." She had nodded, her eyes full of understanding. "Ah, estate matters can be so complicated. My late husband was involved in a similar situation years ago. He always said, the devil's in the details, and the details are often hidden in plain sight in the public record." She then offered a small, knowing smile. "Sometimes a good property title search can reveal a lot. Or old zoning permits. People often forget what they filed years ago." She had then moved on to help another patron, leaving me with a new trail to pursue. Her words were a revelation. Property titles, zoning permits, these were things I hadn't even considered. My focus had been purely on financial and corporate fraud. But the house, the garden, those were physical assets governed by local regulations. Maplewood was a small town. Its records might be less digitized, harder to hide. This was a new layer to the game, a way to potentially expose something locally, something Robert's fancy Seattle firm might have overlooked. That night, as I lay in the uncomfortable silence of my car, the cold seeping into my bones, I didn't feel the crushing despair that had plagued me weeks before. Instead, my mind was buzzing with possibilities. The pain was still there, a phantom limb of my former life, but it was now dulled by a fierce, determined energy. The memory of Mother, once a source of unbearable grief, now became a wellspring of strength. Her tenacity, her love for justice, her unwavering belief in doing what was right, these were the roots holding me fast. Cassie had taken the house, the money, the tangible aspects of my inheritance, but she could never take my intelligence, my resilience, or the burning desire for justice that now consumed me. The game had begun, and the satisfaction, the sweet, insidious taste of it was a powerful antidote to my suffering. I was still in the storm, but I was no longer withering. I was gathering my thorns. The biting wind that whipped through the empty Walmart parking lot felt like a physical assault mirroring the turmoil in my soul. My first night truly homeless away from the deceptive comfort of the house on Rosewood Lane was a descent into a hell I hadn't imagined possible. The ancient Honda Civic mother's last tangible gift was now my only refuge, a metal shell against the indifferent world. I remembered the night I packed, the desperate finality of it all. I had chosen the library instead of her offered charity, my note about the thorns of a rose, a flimsy shield against the tidal wave of despair. Now the weight of that decision pressed down on me, heavy and suffocating. The seats of the Civic, once comfortable for short drives with Mother, were a torture rack for sleep. My back ached, my legs cramped, and every creak of the car, every distant siren, every rumble of a passing truck sent a jolt of terror through me. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to conjure the image of my lavender bedroom, the soft mattress, the familiar scent of home. But all I saw was Cassie's cold, calculating smile, heard Robert's precise legal jargon, and felt the chilling reality that everything I had ever known, every ounce of security, had been ripped away. The grief for Mother was a constant dull throb, but now it was laced with a new venomous pain, the pain of betrayal, of utter abject destitution. This was the peak of my suffering, a canyon of despair that stretched endlessly before me. The days that followed blurred into a monotonous cycle of survival. My few remaining dollars dwindled rapidly, mostly spent on gas to keep the car running and warm in the chilly Massachusetts autumn, and on cheap, unsatisfying food from convenience stores. Stale pastries, instant noodles heated with a loaf from stale pastries, instant noodles, portable burner water from public fountains. Dignity was the first casualty. I quickly realized that maintaining appearances was crucial. To be seen as homeless was to invite pity, judgment, or worse. I found a 24-hour gym paying the meager monthly fee, which became my sanctuary for showers and a moment of privacy in a stall. I would wake before dawn, drive to the gym, and try to make myself presentable using dry shampoo and baby wipes to stretch out the feeling of cleanliness. I remembered Mother's insistence on always looking one's best, even when tending to the garden. Ellie, she would say, presentation speaks volumes. It's a respect for yourself and for others. The irony now was a bitter taste in my mouth. Finding safe places to park was a constant gnawing anxiety. I rotated between different Walmart lots, the periphery of a large mall, and occasionally the quieter streets near the university campus, hoping my car would blend in with student vehicles. Sleep was a luxury I rarely afforded myself, constantly alert, my senses heightened to every shadow, every sound. Loneliness, however, was the cruelest torment. I had no one. My college friends had drifted away after I chose to care for Mother, and my world had shrunk to the four walls of our home. Now even those walls were gone. I would see families in their cars laughing, talking, and a deep, aching void would open in my chest. I remembered the warmth of Mother's hand in mine, the quiet comfort of her presence. Now there was only the cold plastic of the steering wheel. One particularly bleak afternoon, weeks into my new existence, a torrential rainstorm lashed down, turning the car into a damp, claustrophobic prison. My clothes were perpetually clammy, the air thick with condensation. I was shivering despite layering every piece of clothing I owned. I remembered a conversation with Mother years ago when she was teaching me about tending to winter roses. Ellie, she had explained, the most important thing is protection. The roots need insulation, the plant needs shelter from the harshest winds. Without it, even the strongest rose can wither. I felt myself withering, my spirit being slowly crushed under the relentless weight of my circumstances. It was then, in the suffocating dampness of the Civic, that a flash of incandescent rage, sharp and invigorating, cut through my despair. Cassie. She was warm, dry, comfortable, sleeping in my bed, enjoying my inheritance, destroying my mother's legacy. The image of her casual comment about ripping out the rose garden for a swimming pool flared in my mind, a burning ember. It was a desecration, a profound, unforgivable act of contempt. My suffering until this point had been a passive endurance. But in that moment, something shifted. The thorns Mother spoke of, the ones I had promised Cassie she would feel, began to prickle deep within my soul. The despair hadn't lessened, but now it had a direction, a focus. It transformed into a cold, hard resolve. I would not just survive. I would make her pay. My first thought was the will. Robert had said it was perfectly legal. But was it? How could Mother in her right mind have made such a drastic change, going against everything she had ever told me? I needed information. I needed to understand the legal machinations that had robbed me. The library. It was the only place I could think of with free internet access and quiet anonymity. The next morning, the rain had subsided, leaving behind a crisp, cold air. I drove to the main branch of the Boston Public Library, a grand, imposing building that offered a stark contrast to my car-bound existence. Inside, surrounded by towering shelves of books and the hushed whispers of patrons, I felt a flicker of my old self, the scholar, the artist. I found an empty computer terminal and began my research. I started with simple searches contesting a will power of attorney fraud, elderly Lewy body dementia, legal capacity. The legal jargon was dense, but I meticulously took notes on scraps of paper trying to piece together the puzzle. I discovered that contesting a will, especially one executed with a power of attorney, was incredibly difficult, requiring substantial legal resources and irrefutable evidence of undue influence or lack of testamentary capacity. I had neither. Yet the information sparked a tiny, almost imperceptible ember of hope. The document Robert had presented, signed 6 months prior, was crucial. 6 months prior, Mother was deep in her dementia with only fleeting moments of lucidity. It seemed impossible she could have comprehended such complex legal decisions. But how to prove it? Then my research shifted. I started looking into Cassie Sterling and Robert Sterling. Their names were surprisingly easy to find. Cassie was a VP at a prominent tech company in Seattle. Robert was a partner at a well-known corporate law firm. I found news articles about their lavish lifestyle, their charitable contributions, their power couple image. The pictures showed Cassie smiling brightly, an arm linked with Robert's, their faces radiating success and privilege. A wave of nausea mixed with a renewed surge of hatred washed over me. These were the people who had stolen my life. I delved deeper, searching for any public records related to their businesses, their financial dealings. It was a shot in the dark, but I was desperate. I spent hours, days, even in the library, losing myself in the labyrinth of online databases, public records, and obscure legal journals. My mind, once consumed by grief and fear, was now sharp focus, driven by a singular purpose. The hunger that gnawed at my stomach, the cold that seeped into my bones, they became secondary to this new intense pursuit. My first concrete step in exacting my revenge began with Maplewood itself. I knew Cassie wanted to tear out the rose garden for a swimming pool. This wasn't just a casual thought. I'd overheard her discussing it with Robert just after the will reading. The thought of my mother's life's work being eradicated for such a frivolous, self-serving purpose ignited a cold fury within me. This wasn't just property. It was a living monument, a legacy. I knew Mother, with her meticulous nature, would have meticulously documented every detail of her property, including any minor adjustments to the rose garden. I remembered a specific conversation from years ago. Mother had acquired a rare, fragile breed of hybrid tea rose, the Empress's Kiss, that required very specific sun exposure and soil conditions. To accommodate it, she had slightly extended one of the rose beds, pushing it a few feet closer to the property line. Being ever the stickler for rules, she had applied for and received a minor zoning variance. Ellie, she had said, a playful sigh escaping her lips, bureaucracy is the price of beauty, darling, especially when it comes to a few feet of earth. I drove to the Maplewood Town Hall, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't risk being recognized, so I wore an oversized hat and sunglasses, hoping to blend in. The town clerk's office was a hive of quiet activity. I feigned an interest in local history, asking to see old property maps and zoning records for the Rosewood Lane area. I explained that I was researching the historical development of Maplewood's unique residential gardens. The clerk, a kind but busy woman, pointed me to a public computer terminal with access to digitized archives, and there it was. After hours of painstaking scrolling through archaic documents and faded blueprints, I found it: the zoning variance for 142 Rosewood Lane, granted 15 years ago. It explicitly permitted the slight encroachment of the rose garden onto the setback area under the strict condition that the area remain a cultivated garden enhancing the natural landscape. A swimming pool or any other permanent structure would be a blatant violation, requiring a new, much more complex and almost certainly contentious application process. A chill, satisfying current ran through me. This was the precise thorn I needed. Cassie, in her arrogance, would likely assume a simple demolition and construction would suffice. She wouldn't delve into years-old, obscure zoning variances. Using a public computer at a separate location, I composed an anonymous email to the Maplewood Zoning Department. It was a politely worded tip expressing concern about potential unpermitted construction at 142 Rosewood Lane, given rumored plans for a swimming pool that might infringe on established zoning regulations. I subtly referenced the historical significance of the property's landscaping, and attached a scanned copy of the obscure variants. The feeling of sending that email of setting a small legal trap for Cassie was exquisite. The suffering that still clung to me like a damp cloak seemed to lighten, replaced by a surge of grim satisfaction. This wasn't passive despair, this was proactive retribution. My next target was Robert Sterling and his involvement with Green Thumbs Inc. My initial library research had unearthed that peculiar connection. I decided to physically visit the town where Green Thumbs Inc. was located, a small, sleepy agricultural community about an hour's drive from Boston. I needed to see if the past allegations of fraudulent invoices had left any lingering bitterness, any open wounds I could exploit. The company's office was a rundown building on the edge of town, looking exactly as Mother had described it, cutting corners. I observed it for a day, noticing the tired-looking employees, the worn-out trucks. Then I drove to the plant nursery that had sued Green Thumbs Inc. years ago. Davison's Garden and Supply, the sign read, a charming family-owned business that had clearly seen better days. I walked in, my heart pounding. Mrs. Davison, the owner, an elderly woman with sharp, shrewd eyes, greeted me with a weary smile. I introduced myself as Eleanor Vance, a freelance journalist researching local business practices, a plausible cover story. I explained I was interested in the history of local nurseries and their interactions with larger suppliers, subtly steering the conversation towards Green Thumbs Inc. Her smile faded. Green Thumbs, she had said, a bitter edge to her voice, they're nothing but trouble. Tried to cheat us good years back. She recounted the story of the fraudulent invoices, how Green Thumbs Inc. had charged her for premium plants but delivered inferior stock, then provided fake invoices to cover their tracks. We took them to court, she had recalled, but then a fancy lawyer from Seattle came in, oiled his way through everything, buried us in paperwork, and made it so we just barely broke even on a settlement. Said it was cheaper than a long fight. We lost a lot of good business because of them. I listened intently, remembering Mother's words about Robert's sleek appearance and Cassie's shrewdness. Did you ever get the impression, I had asked, lowering my voice, that this lawyer was not entirely on the up and up, that he was more interested in protecting Green Thumbs than in fair-dealing Mrs. Davison had looked at me, a flicker of understanding in her eyes. Oh, he was a snake all right. Smooth as silk but cold as ice. He had this fancy pen too, solid silver with a little rose carved on the cap. Said it was a gift from his sister-in-law for helping with some family business, always twirling it when he talked. My blood ran cold, then hot with a fierce certainty. The silver rose pen. Mother had given Robert a custom-made pen for his services in setting up her trust years ago, a gift she had carefully chosen, knowing his appreciation for fine writing instruments. It was a small detail, but in my mind it was damning. It connected Robert directly to this history of corporate fraud, painting a clear picture of his character. He wasn't just a lawyer, he was a facilitator of deceit. I left Davison's Garden and Supply with a tremor in my hands, a mix of triumph and revulsion. I thanked Mrs. Davison, profusely promising to send her a copy of my article. I had no hard evidence that Robert had orchestrated the Green Thumbs fraud, but I had a witness, a pattern of behavior, and that damning detail about the pen. This wasn't enough for a lawsuit yet, but it was information that could be leaked, that could tarnish his carefully constructed reputation. And for a high-flying corporate lawyer, reputation was everything. The memory of my own humiliation, sleeping in my car, eating stale food, now felt less like suffering and more like fuel. This was a deeper cut, a personal attack on their professional integrity. The satisfaction was intense, almost intoxicating. My final and most symbolic act of initial retribution centered on the rose garden itself. Cassie's plan to destroy it for a swimming pool was not just an affront to my mother's memory. It was a physical act of erasure against everything I had sacrificed for. I couldn't bear the thought. I knew Mother had cherished the idea of the garden being recognized for its beauty and historical significance. I remembered her mentioning the Maplewood Historical Society. I drove back to Rosewood Lane, not to enter the house, but to observe it from a distance. The thought of Cassie and Robert within those walls planning the garden's demise filled me with a fresh wave of nausea. I found Mother's old landscape design files in a box I had packed for her just before her diagnosis, stored in the garage before Cassie had cleared it out. These were her original blueprints, meticulously hand-drawn, detailing every rose variety, every planting date, every hidden feature. Crucially, they also noted several memorial markers within the garden, a small stone buried beneath a sprawling peace rose commemorating the birth of my niece Emily, Cassie's daughter. Another near the center, marking the spot where Mother and Father had first decided to build their life together. These were not just sentimental details. They were markers of the garden's historical narrative, its deep roots in the Vance family's history in Maplewood. I decided to activate Mother's dormant desire for a historic garden designation. I contacted the Maplewood Historical Society, introducing myself as Eleanor Vance, daughter of the late Margaret Vance, and eloquently praised my mother's significant contributions to local landscape architecture. I expressed my heartbreak that her renowned rose garden at 142 Rosewood Lane might be at risk due to imminent renovations by the new owner, my sister, who was unaware of its historical significance. I implied that the garden with its unique varieties and family memorials was a local treasure that deserved protection. The woman at the Historical Society, Miss Albright, was immediately receptive. "Oh, Vance," she had gushed, her voice full of genuine enthusiasm. "Your mother's garden is legendary. We were so saddened when we heard about her passing. We've always wanted to formalize its designation as a historic landmark. It would be an absolute tragedy to lose it." I sent Miss Albright copies of Mother's original blueprints, complete with the memorial markers and links to old gardening magazine articles that had featured the garden years ago. I emphasized the irreplaceable nature of the specific rose varieties and the deep family history embedded in its very design. Within days, the Maplewood Historical Society, protective of local heritage, sent a formal inquiry to the current owner of 142 Rosewood Lane, Cassie Sterling, regarding their plans. They also initiated the process for designating the rose garden as a local landmark, a process that, if successful, would place strict limitations on any modifications to the garden without extensive review and approval from the Historical Society. The thought of Cassie receiving that official letter demanding an explanation for her plans to rip out a potential landmark filled me with a deep, resonating sense of triumph. It was a net slowly but surely closing around her. My pain, the crushing weight of my homelessness, seemed to lighten with each thread I wove into this web of retribution. This wasn't just revenge. It was a restoration of dignity, a silent promise to my mother that her beloved garden and her memory would not be desecrated. The thorns were growing sharper, and the first blood, metaphorical though it was about to be drawn. I was no longer just surviving. I was fighting. And in the fight, I was finding a terrible, beautiful strength. The cold plastic of the steering wheel felt less like a symbol of my destitution, and more like the tiller of a ship guiding me through uncharted, treacherous waters. My nights were still spent in the cramped Honda Civic, my days still a constant negotiation with hunger and the elements. But the agonizing despair that had once suffocated me had been systematically chipped away, replaced by a chilling, precise satisfaction. Each carefully placed thorn of my plan, each calculated move, felt like a vital breath of fresh air in the suffocating emptiness that had once been my life. I was still Eleanor Vance, the discarded daughter, but I was also something more: a strategist, a hunter driven by a primal need for justice. My first calculated strike had been the anonymous email to the Maplewood Zoning Department, referencing the obscure variants on the rose garden. I had sent it from a burner phone at a library miles away from Maplewood, cloaked in careful anonymity. The waiting was excruciating, a slow burn of anticipation. I knew bureaucracy moved at a glacial pace, but I also knew Cassie. She thrived on efficiency, on quick, decisive action. Any bureaucratic snag would be an irritating pebble in her perfectly polished shoe. A week after sending the email, I found myself back in the Maplewood Public Library, pretending to research local history but secretly scanning the online minutes of the zoning board meetings. And then I saw it buried deep in the agenda of an upcoming meeting: inquiry regarding potential unpermitted structural changes at 142 Rosewood Lane. My heart gave a triumphant lurch. It was a small item easily overlooked, but for me, it was a thunderclap. I imagined the moment Cassie received the formal letter from the zoning department. I pictured her impeccably dressed, probably at the breakfast nook overlooking the very garden she intended to destroy, sipping her expensive coffee. The initial reaction, I guessed, would be annoyance, a dismissive wave of her hand. More local nonsense, she would probably say to Robert, her voice tinged with exasperation. "Just deal with it, darling." But then, as Robert the lawyer delved into the specifics, the annoyance would curdle into something more sinister. I knew he would eventually unearth the old variants, the one Mother had meticulously filed for her beloved Empress's kiss rose. The requirement for the area to remain a cultivated garden in harmony with the natural aesthetic. A swimming pool was anything but. My imagination, once filled with artistic visions, now painted a vivid picture of their dawning realization. Robert, usually so composed, his face would tighten, a flicker of genuine concern replacing his usual impassive demeanor. Cassie, I imagined him saying, his voice a strained whisper, "This is problematic. There's an old variance on record. It specifically protects that section of the garden. And Cassie, her face contorting, the initial irritation giving way to a more potent rage. A variance for a rosebush, that old woman and her ridiculous paperwork. Who even cares about a 20-year-old permit for a few feet of dirt? The image of their frustration, the dawning horror that their grand plans for the property were now mired in bureaucratic red tape, filled me with a cold, clear pleasure. It was the first prick of the thorn, a minor inconvenience for them, perhaps, but a monumental victory for me. The gnawing emptiness in my stomach didn't disappear, but a profound sense of rightness settled over me. My suffering, though physically unchanged, felt lighter, less suffocating. Next, I turned my attention to Robert Sterling and the Green Thumbs Inc. connection. Mrs. Davison's story, the slick lawyer with the silver rose pen. It was a narrative waiting to be told. I couldn't directly sue them. I lacked the resources and the concrete sealed evidence. But I could wound them, expose their hypocrisy. And for people like Cassie and Robert, whose lives were meticulously curated public performances, exposure was a death sentence. I drafted an anonymous letter carefully detailing the allegations of fraudulent invoicing against Green Thumbs Inc., Robert Sterling's firm's involvement as a restructuring consultant, and Mrs. Davison's account of the settlement. I didn't make direct accusations against Robert, but I painted a picture of a pattern of ethically questionable behavior. I included the detail about the silver rose pen, knowing it would be a personal sting. I sent this letter along with snippets of my online research on Robert's firm and Green Thumbs Inc. to a small, independent investigative newspaper in Boston. The Beacon Review, known for its dogged pursuit of local corruption, however minor. A few weeks passed. My physical reality remained unchanged: cold nights, furtive showers, cheap food. But my mind was a vortex of anticipation. I checked local news outlets religiously, my heart quickening with every new headline. Then, one Tuesday morning, as I scrolled through the Beacon Review website on a library computer, I saw it. A headline smaller than I would have hoped, but there nonetheless. Questions arise over Sterling Law Partners' past corporate consulting. The article was discreet, carefully worded, but devastating. It detailed the Green Thumbs Inc. lawsuit, Mrs. Davison's allegations of fraudulent invoicing without naming her to protect her privacy, and the unusual involvement of a prominent Seattle law firm in a small local dispute. It raised questions about due diligence and ethical oversight in Robert Sterling's past consulting work. There was no mention of the rose pen, but the damage was done. The article ended with a quote from an unnamed legal ethics expert suggesting that such associations, even if not directly criminal, can raise significant concerns about a lawyer's professional judgment and client relationships, especially when they involve a vulnerable local business. I imagined Robert's reaction, a cold, hard knot of satisfaction forming in my gut. He would be furious, livid. His reputation, his carefully constructed facade of impeccable legal integrity, was now tarnished. His partners at the firm would be asking questions. Clients, especially high-net-worth individuals who valued discretion above all else, would be hesitant. The financial repercussions would be subtle at first, but insidious, like a slow-acting poison. I could almost hear the argument in the house on Rosewood Lane. Cassie, her voice rising in a crescendo of anger. Robert, what is this dreadful article? Questions arise. What on earth have you done? This could impact my business, our reputation, Emily's school applications, and Robert, his usual calm demeanor shattered, would probably lash back. It's old news, Cassie. Something from years ago. How did this even get out? Who is doing this? The seed of suspicion I hoped would begin to sprout between them. The satisfaction of this was immense, a balm to my aching soul. The constant physical discomfort of my homelessness felt almost trivial compared to the profound pleasure of witnessing their carefully constructed world begin to crack. My suffering had given way to a ruthless focus, a powerful drive to dismantle their empire of lies piece by agonizing piece. My final and most symbolic strike, the one involving the Maplewood Historical Society and the Rose Garden, landed with a dramatic flourish. A few days after the Beacon Review article, I checked the Maplewood Historical Society's website. Under recent news, a prominent announcement declared Maplewood Historical Society initiates landmark designation for Vance Rose Garden at 142 Rosewood Lane. It also mentioned a public hearing scheduled for next month to discuss the proposed designation and an open invitation for residents to submit testimonials about the garden's significance. I imagined the sheer, unadulterated shock on Cassie's face when she received the formal notification. This wasn't just a zoning inquiry. This was a potential public designation, a permanent restriction on her property. The very symbol of my mother's life, the garden she intended to obliterate, was now poised to become a protected landmark. I pictured the scene, Cassie probably throwing the letter onto the polished mahogany table in the living room, her face white with disbelief. A landmark, I imagined her screaming, "For a garden, who would do this? What is going on, Robert? This is insane. Our pool plans, our property value. This is a nightmare." Robert, his own nerves frayed from the Beacon Review article, would likely be pacing, running a hand through his already disheveled hair. "This is unprecedented, Cassie. Someone is actively working against us. This isn't random. The timing? It's too precise. The implication of a deliberate, unseen hand, a shadowy adversary, would gnaw at them. The thought of them squirming, their carefully laid plans crumbling, was a potent elixir. I knew the designation process would involve public hearings, local press, and a spotlight on the very property they had so ruthlessly seized. They would have to justify tearing down a potential historic landmark. The irony was delicious. Mother's legacy through my efforts was rising from the ashes, and Cassie's greedy aspirations were being exposed for their destructive vulgarity. I walked the perimeter of the rose garden that evening, staying hidden in the shadows of the adjacent park. The bare branches, once symbols of my own desolate state, now seemed to stand tall, defiant, imbued with a new potent energy. A thin layer of frost sparkled on the dormant buds, promising future blooms. I remembered Mother telling me, "Ellie, sometimes the greatest beauty is found in defiance. The rose defies winter and blooms again." The satisfaction I felt was profound, a deep, resonant hum within my core. It wasn't the fleeting pleasure of vindictiveness, but the enduring triumph of agency. I had been powerless, a victim of their greed and deceit. Now, from the shadows of my desperate existence, I was dismantling their empire piece by piece. The physical hardships of my life were still real. The hunger, the cold, the constant fear. But they no longer defined me. They fueled me. Each successful strike against Cassie and Robert was a small victory against the pain, a reaffirmation of my strength. They thought they had taken everything, but they had awakened something far more dangerous, a daughter's unwavering devotion sharpened into a weapon of cold, precise vengeance. And the most satisfying part, they still had no idea who was holding the blade. The game was far from over, but the tides were irrevocably turning. Their shock and collapse were just the beginning. The biting wind still pierced through the thin walls of my Honda Civic, a constant reminder of my physical reality, but it no longer held the power to chill my soul. That power had been replaced by a different kind of cold, the unyielding resolve of a woman scorned, tempered by the quiet satisfaction of a plan meticulously executed. My thorns, carefully sharpened, were now poised to strike. The final act of this bitter play was about to unfold. The public hearing for the Maplewood Historical Society's landmark designation of the Vance Rose Garden was scheduled for a Tuesday evening. I knew Cassie and Robert would be there, forced to defend their plans in a public forum. This was my stage, and I was no longer content to be an unseen puppeteer. I would be present not as the ghost of Rosewood Lane, but as Eleanor Vance, daughter of Margaret Vance, ready to reclaim what was mine. I spent the day leading up to the hearing in a quiet corner of the library preparing. I had printed copies of the zoning variants, the Beacon Review article about Robert's questionable past, and most crucially, a few carefully selected pages from my mother's journal. These were the entries from her rare lucid days where she had expressed her explicit wishes for the garden and her house, her deep love for me, and her growing fear of Cassie's influence. I even had a copy of the old spiritual will she had drafted with our neighbor Mrs. Henderson years before the dementia truly took hold, a document stating her desire for a fair division of assets and the specific request for the garden to remain untouched. It was not legally binding, but it was morally damning. As evening approached, I drove to the Maplewood Town Hall. The parking lot was surprisingly full, a testament to the local community's interest in their heritage. I parked far from the main entrance, watching as people filtered in. I saw Mrs. Davison from the nursery, her face grim. I saw Miss Evans, the librarian, chatting with a group of local garden club members. My heart pounded a drumbeat of anticipation and trepidation. This was it, the moment of truth. I entered the crowded meeting room, slipping into a seat at the back, my oversized hat pulled low, my face partially obscured by a scarf. The room buzzed with muted conversations, a mixture of curiosity and local gossip. At the front, seated behind a long table, were the members of the Maplewood Zoning Board and the Maplewood Historical Society. Miss Albright from the Historical Society looked particularly determined. Then they arrived. Cassie, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, her hair perfectly coiffed, walked in with an air of dismissive authority, Robert by her side, his usual composed demeanor slightly strained. They looked like they were walking into a corporate boardroom, not a town hall meeting. They took seats at the front, flanked by their own legal counsel, a young, nervous-looking associate from Robert's firm. I watched them, my chest a hollow ache but my gaze unwavering. The hearing began. Miss Albright opened with a passionate speech about the Vance Rose Garden's unique historical and horticultural significance to Maplewood. She presented my mother's original blueprints, highlighting the unique varieties and the family memorial markers. Several local residents, members of the garden club, then stood up to share their personal anecdotes about the garden, about Margaret Vance's generosity in opening it for tours, about its beauty being a point of pride for the community. Each story was a direct jab at Cassie's cold utilitarian vision. Then came the zoning board's turn. Mr. Henderson, the chairman, a stern-faced man I remembered from my childhood, cleared his throat. He referenced the anonymous tip and the subsequent review of records. Mr. and Mrs. Sterling, he had stated, his voice firm, our records clearly show an existing variance on a portion of the property at 142 Rosewood Lane, specifically stipulating that the area must remain a cultivated garden. Any plans for a swimming pool or similar permanent structure would constitute a significant violation and would require a new extensive application process, including multiple public hearings and significant environmental impact assessments. Cassie's face, usually so composed, began to twitch. Robert, however, stepped forward, his lawyer persona snapping into place. Mr. Chairman, he had stated, his voice smooth, this is an archaic variance for a few rose bushes. We intend to enhance the property, not diminish it. Our plans for a modern leisure facility will significantly increase property value and community appeal. These petty restrictions are simply an impediment to progress. He dismissed the Historical Society's concerns as sentimental nonsense and the zoning variance as an oversight from a bygone era. A wave of murmurs rippled through the room. Cassie nodded, a sneer forming on her lips. They were arrogant, dismissive, completely devoid of understanding for the local sentiment for Mother's legacy. This was my cue. I rose from my seat at the back of the room, every eye turning towards me. My heart hammered, but my voice, when it came, was clear and steady, devoid of the tremor I expected. Mr. Chairman, members of the board, I am Eleanor Vance, daughter of Margaret Vance. A ripple of shock went through the room. Cassie and Robert froze, their heads snapping towards me, their faces draining of color. Cassie's jaw dropped, her eyes wide with disbelief, then a dawning horror. Robert's face, usually so controlled, was a mask of utter bewilderment, then a flash of panic. They had not seen me since I walked out, had believed me to be a problem neatly solved, relegated to the fringes of society. My sudden appearance, my very existence, was a direct refutation of their carefully constructed narrative. I am here, I continued, walking slowly towards the front, holding up Mother's journal and the copies of the old will, to speak for my mother, Margaret Vance, and for the truth that my sister and her husband have so cruelly distorted. Cassie found her voice a strangled, high-pitched shriek. Ellie, what are you doing here? This is absurd. You have no standing. Robert's face was a mixture of fear and fury. Eleanor, you will cease and desist. You are not a party to these proceedings. I ignored them. I turned to the board, my gaze steady. My mother, Margaret Vance, dedicated her life to beauty, to integrity, and to this garden. She also dedicated her final agonizing years to me, her caregiver. My sister, Cassandra Sterling, and her husband, Robert Sterling, systematically exploited my mother's dementia to alter her will, to disinherit me, and to seize her entire estate. A gasp went through the room. I held up the pages from Mother's journal. In these pages, penned in her own hand during her few moments of clarity, my mother expressed her unwavering desire for me to inherit this house, this garden. She wrote of her fear of Cassie's greed, of being pressured to sign documents she did not understand. I then presented the copies of the spiritual will witnessed by Mrs. Henderson. This document, witnessed by a longtime neighbor, outlines her true wishes before her mind began its final fade. Mrs. Henderson, seated in the audience, stood up, her voice trembling but clear. I remember signing that document for Margaret. She was very clear about what she wanted for Ellie. The air in the room was thick with tension, a palpable sense of outrage building against Cassie and Robert. Cassie was now shaking, her carefully constructed composure completely shattered. Robert, his legal mind racing, probably understood the full implications of this public exposure. This wasn't just a zoning issue anymore. It was public accusation of elder abuse and fraud. Then I delivered my final blow against Robert. And as for Mr. Robert Sterling's integrity, I had stated, my voice dripping with cold scorn. Perhaps the Maplewood Zoning Board and the Maplewood Historical Society would also be interested in the details of Green Thumb's Inc. and the allegations of fraudulent invoicing that Mr. Sterling's firm consulted on years ago. Perhaps the Legal Ethics Committee in Seattle would find that Beacon Review article, which recently resurfaced, to be of particular interest in light of current events. The effect was devastating. Robert's face went from pale to ashen. The legal associate beside him visibly recoiled. The Beacon Review article had been a minor blip for him, a quiet professional embarrassment. But now linked directly to allegations of elder abuse and a fraudulent, well, it was a death knell for his career. His firm would disassociate from him, his clients would flee. His reputation, his entire professional identity was irrevocably shattered. Cassie let out a choked sob, burying her face in her hands. The room was utterly silent, save for the muffled sound of her weeping. The silence was not just from shock. It was the heavy quiet of judgment, of righteous indignation. They were exposed utterly and completely in front of their community, their carefully cultivated image of success and respectability crumbling into dust. Their dead silence was deafening. Their collapse was total. The aftermath was a whirlwind, but one that I, for the first time in a long time, felt I could navigate. The Maplewood Historical Society immediately voted to fast-track the landmark designation for the Rose Garden, effectively scuttling any of Cassie's demolition plans. The zoning board launched a formal investigation into Robert's previous legal dealings and the circumstances surrounding the will. More importantly, a pro bono lawyer from a firm specializing in elder abuse, having read the Beacon Review article and my public accusation, immediately offered to take my case. The legal battle that followed was grueling but swift. With the undeniable evidence from Mother's journal, Mrs. Henderson's testimony, and Robert's tarnished reputation, Cassie and Robert had no ground to stand on. The court quickly overturned the fraudulent will, declaring it null and void due to undue influence and Mother's diminished capacity. The house, the rose garden, and the substantial trust fund my mother had meticulously built for me were returned to my rightful ownership. Cassie and Robert faced not only the complete loss of their ill-gotten gains but also significant civil penalties for elder abuse and fraud. Robert was disbarred, his legal career over. Cassie's reputation was ruined, her professional life in tatters. They moved out of Maplewood, their silence now one of public shame and professional ruin, their carefully curated lives shattered beyond repair. As for me, the immediate rush of vindication slowly, gently subsided, replaced by a profound, almost spiritual weariness. I walked back into the house on Rosewood Lane, no longer as a ghost but as its rightful owner. The scent of roses still lingered, but now it felt like a welcome, healing embrace. The dust had settled, the battle was won, but the scars remained. The physical exhaustion of my homeless period slowly began to fade, but the psychological wounds ran deep. I found myself hoarding food, checking door locks obsessively, and waking in a panic, expecting to find myself in the confines of my Civic. The memory of Mother, once a source of pure grief, now brought a complex mix of emotions, love loss, and a deep understanding of her final struggle. I sought therapy, recognizing that while justice had been served, healing was a journey I had to undertake myself. My therapist, a kind woman named Dr. Evelyn Stone, helped me process the layers of trauma, the grief of losing Mother, the profound betrayal by Cassie, and the sheer terror of homelessness. Ellie, she had told me gently, your strength in fighting for justice was immense. Now you need to channel that same strength into healing yourself. You survived, but you don't have to carry the weight of that survival alone. I started by tending to the rose garden. Each day I would spend hours outside, carefully pruning the dormant bushes, turning the soil, preparing them for spring. It was a meditative act, a quiet dialogue with my mother's spirit. As the first green shoots began to appear, a symbol of resilience, I felt a similar rebirth within myself. I reconnected with Mrs. Henderson and with Miss Evans from the library, who had unwittingly given me my first leads. They became my surrogate family, offering kindness and support. I eventually resumed my art, not with the desperate ambition of my youth, but with a newfound serenity. My canvases were no longer filled with abstract angst, but with the quiet beauty of resilience, the delicate strength of things that endure. I sold some of Mother's old rose varietals at local markets, using the proceeds to fund a small community garden project in Maplewood, a place where people could find solace and connection. The lessons I learned were etched onto my soul deeper than any physical scar. I learned that family truly defined is not by blood alone, but by love, loyalty, and integrity. Cassie was my sister by birth, but she had severed that bond through her greed. The kindness of strangers, the quiet support of a community often proved more familial than the ties of blood. I learned the profound importance of voice and vigilance. My mother in her fading moments had lost hers, but I found mine rising from the ashes of my own despair. I learned that silence in the face of injustice is complicity, and that even the weakest among us can find strength when driven by a righteous cause. Most importantly, I learned that revenge, while satisfying in the short term, is not the ultimate answer to healing. The dismantling of Cassie and Robert's world brought a grim triumph, but true peace came from rebuilding my own, from nurturing the garden, from pursuing my art, from tending to my own soul. It came from honoring my mother's legacy, not by clinging to material possessions, but by embodying her spirit of resilience, beauty, and unwavering kindness. The house on Rosewood Lane, with its now thriving rose garden, became more than just a home. It was a sanctuary, a testament to enduring love, and a symbol of hard-won justice. The thorns of the roses were still there, a reminder of the pain, but now they were guardians protecting the delicate blooms of hope and healing that had finally begun to blossom in my life. And I, Eleanor Vance, the discarded daughter, finally felt whole-rooted and ready for whatever new season awaited me.